That speech from the Justice Secretary Michael Gove very shortly, accusing the Remain campaign of conjuring up bogeymen to try to win the EU referendum vote. The pro-Leave Justice Secretary said leaving the EU would liberate and empower the country. He'll be setting out his thoughts in a speech imminently. But first, let's talk to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's just outside the venue for us in Westminster. Norman, what can we expect to hear from Michael Gove this morning?
Well, we've had a number of Mr. Gove's arguments pre-briefed to us, so we know he's going to attack the government over immigration, but I think he's actually just getting up to his feet, so we should be able to hear Mr. Gove now, I think.
One of the most striking things about the debate on Britain's future relationship with Europe is that the case for staying is couched overwhelmingly in negative and pessimistic terms, while the case for leaving is positive and optimistic. Those of us who want to leave believe that Britain's best days lie ahead, that our country has tremendous untapped potential, which independence would unleash, and our institutions, values and people would make an even more positive difference to the world if we are unshackled from the past. In contrast, the In campaign want us to believe that Britain is beaten and broken, that it can't survive without the help of Jean-Claude Juncker and his Commission looking after us. And if we dare to assert ourselves, then all the terrors of the earth will be unleashed upon our head. It treats people, I'm afraid, like children, unfit to be trusted and easily scared by ghost stories. Indeed, if you listen to some of those campaigning for Britain to stay in the European Union, you would think that for Britain to leave would be to boldly go where no man has gone before. In fact, of course, it would be to join the overwhelming majority of countries which choose to govern themselves. The In campaign asked repeatedly, what does out look like? As if the idea of governing ourselves is some extraordinary and novel proposition that requires a fresh a priori justification. Democratic self-government, the form of government that we in Britain actually invented, has been a roaring success for most of the nations who've adopted it. And while we enjoyed democratic self-government, we developed the world's strongest economy, its most respected political institutions, its most tolerant approach towards refugees, its best publicly funded health service, and its most respected public broadcaster. Under democratic self-government, countries such as Australia, Canada, the USA and New Zealand all enjoy excellent economic growth, global influence, the ability to control their own borders, to act independently, either to close them or to open them to more refugees, and they also have strong, durable, trusted security links. And democratic self-government has manifestly brought benefits to India, Japan, Norway, Switzerland, South Africa, South Korea, and scores of other nations, all making their way successfully in the world. Indeed, the truth is that it's membership of an organisation like the European Union, which is an anomaly today. The former president of the Commission himself, Manuel Barroso, likes to describe the EU as an empire, because we have the dimension of empires. The facts suggest he actually has a point, though not quite the one that he intended. It is a fact that the EU is a multinational federation, with no democratically elected leader or government, with policies decided by a central bureaucracy, with a mock parliament, which enjoys no popular mandate for action, and with peripheries, which are either impoverished or agitating for secession. It's a fact that that also describes Austria-Hungary under the Habsburgs, the Russian Empire under Nicholas II, Rome under its later emperors, or the Ottoman Empire in its final years. It's hardly a model for either economic dynamism or social progress, which is why we should not be surprised that the countries of the EU are proving neither particularly economically dynamic or socially progressive. It's a fact that youth unemployment in Spain is 45.3%. In Portugal, it's 30%. In Greece, it's 51.9%. It's a fact that Spain, Portugal and Greece, Eurozone austerity policies have meant cutting spending on health, welfare and public services. It's a fact that not a single one of the world's top 20 universities is in the Eurozone. It's a fact that Euro bailouts have meant that taxpayers' money from across the EU has gone into paying off the bankers who got European nations into a mess in the first place. And yet we are somehow expected to believe that if Britain left the organisation, which gave us the economic disaster of the euro, and turned the world's richest continent into its slowest growing, that it's this country which would be acting irrationally. The only thing that's irrational is the picture the In campaign tries to paint of life as an independent nation. Some of the In campaigners seek to imply, insinuate, and sometimes just declare that if we left the EU, we would not be able to take the train or fly cheaply to European nations. If by some miracle we somehow managed to make it to distant Calais or exotic Boulogne, we would find that, unique among developed nations, our mobile telephones would no longer work. Heaven help us if we fell ill. As citizens from a country outside the EU, we would be barred from all of Europe's hospitals and left to expire unmourned in some foreign field. But the consequences wouldn't end with the continent becoming a no-go zone. According to some In campaigners, independence also means the devastation of large areas of our national life. Our football teams would apparently be denuded of foreign players. So Premier League matches would have to become, at best, five-a-side contests. And we better not schedule those fixtures for dark evenings, because there'd be no electricity left for the floodlights after our energy supplies would have suffered a shock akin to the meltdown of a nuclear power plant. The City of London would become a ghost town, our manufacturing industries would be sanctioned more punitively than even communist North Korea, decades would pass before a single British Land Rover or Mr. Kipling cake could ever again be sold in France, and in the meantime our farmers would have been driven from the land by poverty worse than the potato famine. To cap it all, an alliance of Vladimir Putin, Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump, emboldened by our weakness, would, like some geopolitical equivalent of the Penguin, Catwoman and the Joker, be liberated to spread chaos worldwide and subvert democracy. I sometimes think that the In campaign appears to be operating to a script written by George R.R. Martin and Stephen King. Brexit would mean a combination of a feast for crows and misery. It's a deeply pessimistic view of the British people's potential and a profoundly negative vision of the future, which just isn't rooted in reality. The idea that if Britain voted to leave the European Union, we would instantly become some sort of hermit kingdom, a North Atlantic North Korea, only without that country's fund of international goodwill, is a fantasy. It's a phantom. It's a great, grotesque, patronising and preposterous Peter Mandelsonian conceit that imagines that the people of this country are mere children, capable of being frightened into obedience by conjuring up new bogeymen every night. The truth is that the day after Britain voted to leave the European Union, we would not fall off the edge of the world or find the English Channel replaced by a sulphurous ocean of burning pitch. Quite the opposite. We'd be starting a process, a happy journey to a better future. But crucially, it's a journey where we would be in control, a journey whose pace and direction we would determine for ourselves, and whose destination we would choose. By contrast, if we stay in the EU, we give up control. Because just as leaving is a process, not an event, so staying in the EU means accepting a process, not settling for a secure resting place. Before I explain how the process of leaving would work for Britain and Europe, let me first say a little about the risks of staying. Because if we vote to stay, the EU's bosses and bureaucrats will take that as carte blanche to continue taking more power and money away from Britain. They'll say that we voted for more Europe. Any protests on our part will be met with a complacent shrug and a reminder that we were given our own very special negotiation and our own bespoke referendum. And now we've agreed to stay. And that's that. Britain has spoken, it said oui, and now it had better shut up and suck it up. In truth, if we vote to stay, we are hostages to their agenda. Brussels has already set out the official timetable for the next great transfer of powers from EU members to EU institutions after our referendum is safely out of the way. It's all there in the 5 Presidents' report. It's a fact that under qualified majority voting in the rules of the Lisbon Treaty, which of course the Conservative Party campaigned against, the Eurozone countries have a permanent and unstoppable majority, allowing them to set the agenda and to overrule our interests. Worse, under the terms of the recent deal we've struck with the other EU nations, we've effectively surrendered our veto on their next leap forward. Now, some might argue that we're insulated from that process because we're outside the Eurozone and we're no longer committed to the goal of ever closer union. Sadly, that's wrong. The Eurozone nations can vote together to impose rules on every EU state, whether in or out of the euro, and we cannot veto that. Deleting the phrase ever closer union also offers no protection. It's a fact that as a phrase or doctrine, in its own right, ever closer union has only been cited in 0.19% of cases before the European Court of Justice, and it's not been relevant to any of the ECJ's seminal judgments that expanded its power. The in-camp cannot name a single decision of the court that would have been decided differently had the phrase never been in the treaties. The court has the power and freedom to interpret the treaties entirely as it wishes, which is always in the service of greater European integration, regardless of what our deal might say about ever closer union. The inclusion of the phrase has not been a driving factor in the EU's expansion, so removing it makes no effective difference and will not stop the next EU power grab. And if we do try to object, the European Court of Justice, the Supreme Court of the EU, can force us to submit to the judgment of others regardless of what our population, our parliament, or even our own judges might think is right. It's a fact that the European Communities Act 1972 and subsequent judgments make clear that EU law, as decided by the process of qualified majority voting, in which we have no veto, and interpreted by the ECJ, that trumps the decisions of and the laws passed by democratically elected politicians here in Britain. And what's more, the European Court now has the perfect legal excuse to grab more power with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which goes even further than the older post-war European Convention on Human Rights. Now, of course, we were promised that we had a cast-iron opt-out on this. The Blair government originally said that the Charter would have all the force and law of the Beano, in which case Dennis the Menace must be the single most powerful figure in European jurisprudence, because the ECJ has now informed us that our opt-out was worthless, and it started making judgments applying the Charter to UK law. The ECJ can now control how all member states apply the crucial 1951 UN Convention on Asylum and Refugees, because the Charter incorporates it in EU law. So Britain's lost control of a vital area of power, and the European Court can increasingly decide how our policy must work. The ECJ has recently used the Charter to make clear that it can determine how our intelligence services monitor suspected terrorists. So how long before the ECJ starts undermining the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreements that have been a foundation of British security since 1945 and which are the source of jealousy and suspicion in Brussels? The ECJ recently used the Charter to make clear that the European Court, not our Parliament, can decide the issue of whether convicted felons can vote, and if so, how far this right should be extended. And the ECJ used the Charter to tell us that the European Court will decide whether we can deport Abu Hamza's daughter-in-law. It's even used the Charter to increase the price of insurance for women. How long before the ECJ uses other provisions in the Charter to erode even more of our independence? How far will the European Court go? We know that it does not see itself bound by anything other than a drive to deepen integration. It's consistently ignored and overruled any body which stands in its way. Even decisions which have been made and agreed by every EU state have been overturned if the court thinks that they impede integration. The court's already rejected deals on human rights, which the EU nations agreed at the time of the Lisbon Treaty, and it's also overridden the deal that the Danes did with the EU on citizenship after Maastricht in 1992. We know that it is entirely up to the European Court itself how to interpret the terms of our recent New Deal. There's no appeal, there's nothing we can do about its decisions, just as there was nothing that we could do when it sank our supposed opt-out from the Charter. But don't just take it from me. My friend, the former Attorney General and in-campaigner Dominic Grieve, said only last year, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg has predatory qualities, which could be very inimical to some of our national practices. It's clear that if we vote to stay, we are giving away more power and control to unaccountable EU institutions this year and every year. If we vote to stay, the EU can then press ahead with the plans outlined in the Five Presidents' report, which I mentioned a moment ago. And those plans include the transfer of powers over tax, so that we could lose vital fiscal freedoms. They also include the transfer of powers over the financial system, so we would be less able to guard against a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis. And those plans also include the transfer of powers over the heart of our legal system, so we're less able to safeguard the integrity of the contract and property law, which is crucial to attracting global investors to Britain. If we vote to stay, we also risk paying even more of the bills for the euro's failure. We were told in 2010 that we would not be liable for any more euro bailouts, yet in 2015 those assurances turned out to be wrong. If we vote to stay, British taxpayers will inevitably be paying ever higher bills for years to come, as the EU uses its growing and unchecked power to transfer resources to subsidise failure. If we vote to stay, we're not settling for the status quo. we're voting to be a hostage, locked in the boot of a car, driven by others to a place and at a pace that we have no control over. In stark contrast, if we vote to leave, we take back control. The day after we vote to leave, we hold all the cards, and we can choose the path that we want. The leader of the In campaign, Stuart Rose, has acknowledged there will be no turbulence or trauma on Independence Day. Nothing is going to happen if we come out in the first 5 years, probably, he confessed, and then went on to admit there will be absolutely no change. And just as it is the case that when Britain votes to leave, nothing in itself changes overnight, so the process and pace of change is in our hands. There is no arbitrary deadline which we must meet to secure our future, and indeed no arbitrary existing model which we have to accept in order to prosper. It's been argued that the moment Britain votes to leave, a process known as Article 50 is triggered, whereby the clock starts ticking and every aspect of any new arrangement with the EU must be concluded within 2 years of that vote being recorded, or else. But there's no requirement for that to occur. Quite the opposite. Logically, in the days after a vote to leave, the Prime Minister would discuss the way ahead with the Cabinet and consult Parliament before taking any significant step. Preliminary, informal conversations would take place with the EU to explore how best to proceed. It would not be in any nation's interest artificially to accelerate the process, and I don't think any responsible government would hit the start button on a 2-year legal process without preparing appropriately. Nor would it be in anyone's interest to hurry parliamentary processes. We can set the pace. We will repeal the 1972 European Communities Act, which automatically gives EU law legal force, but we can change it on our terms at a time of our choosing. And after we establish full legal independence, we can then decide which EU-inspired rules and regulations we want to keep, which we want to repeal, and which we wish to modify. It's also important to realise that while we calmly take our time to change the law, the one thing which will not change is our ability to trade freely with Europe. The In campaign often argues that we would find it impossible to reach a trading agreement with EU nations after we vote leave. While there are, of course, some questions up for negotiation, which will occupy our highly skilled Foreign Office civil servants, resolving them fully and properly won't be any more complicated or onerous than the day-to-day work that they undertake now, navigating their way through EU recitals, trilogues and framework directives. Indeed, if we vote to stay, that work will only grow more complex, and negotiations in the EU will only become more burdensome. But if we vote to leave, the need for this bureaucratic processology will come to an end. The core of our new arrangement with the EU is clear. There is a free trade zone stretching from Iceland to Turkey that all European nations have access to, regardless of whether they are in or out of the Euro or EU. After we vote to leave, we'll remain in this zone. This suggestion that Bosnia, Serbia, Albania and the Ukraine would remain part of this free trade area and Britain would be on the outside with just Belarus is as credible as Jean-Claude Juncker joining UKIP. Agreeing to maintain this continental free trade zone is the simple course, and it's emphatically in everyone's interests. As our European friends adjust to the referendum result, they'll quickly calculate that it's in their own interest to maintain the current free trade arrangements that they enjoy with the UK. After all, they sell far more to us than we do to them. In 2015, the UK recorded a £67.7 billion deficit in the trade of goods and services with the EU, up from £58.8 billion in 2014. German car manufacturers, who sell £16.2 billion more to us each year than we sell to them, will insist that their government maintains access to our markets. French farmers, who sell us £1.37 billion worth of wine and other beverages, £737 million more than we sell to them, will insist on maintaining access to our supermarkets. And Italian designers, whose fashion houses sell the UK £1 billion worth of clothes, will similarly insist on access to our consumers. Now, it's been suggested that in a fit of collectively organised and intensively sustained international pique, all 27 nations of the EU would put every other priority aside and labour night and day for months to bury their own individual differences and harm their own individual economic interests just to punish us. Now, I accept that some in the Brussels elite will be cross at our temerity in refusing to accept their continued rule. But the idea that the German government would damage its car manufacturers and impoverish workers in those factories to make a political point about Britain's choices, or the idea that the French government would ignore its farmers and damage their welfare just to strike a pose, or that the Italian government would undermine its struggling industries just to please Brussels, well, that's ridiculous. And the idea that all of them, and 24 other nations, would have as their highest economic priority in the months ahead, making it more difficult to sell to Britain, and the belief that they would bend all of their diplomatic, political and financial muscle to that sole end, well, that's preposterous. Why would any of them wish to commit an act of profound economic self-harm? And if any of them did, why would all the other EU nations let them? It's sometimes claimed that we will only get free trade if we accept free movement. But the EU has free trade deals with nations that obviously do not involve free movement. You don't need free movement of people to have free trade and friendly cooperation. Indeed, worldwide, it's been countries outside the EU's bureaucracy which have been selling more and more goods to EU nations. Over the last 5 years, exports of goods from the United States to the EU increased faster than exports from the UK to the EU. Indeed, the amount that we sold to Europe actually declined after the EU moved to setting more and more common bureaucratic rules in the name of the so-called single market. After joining the EEC in 1972, our trade with it did grow. And in 1993, 51.7% of our exports went to the EU. But after 1993, however, our trade with the EU broadly flatlined and then declined. Now, 56.3% of our exports go to countries outside the EU. Of course, and we must always remember this, increased trade isn't the property of politicians. It's testament to the endeavours and hard work of British entrepreneurs and British workers. And it is certainly no thanks to the EU's trade negotiators. Because the EU, after years of trying, still doesn't have trade deals with the US, China, or India. But if we vote to leave, we can take control of our trade negotiations and seal those deals more quickly. We can strip out the protectionism and special interests that drag down EU negotiations and focus more energetically on reducing barriers to trade, to create more jobs for British workers, greater opportunities for British exporters, and cheaper prices for British consumers. Instead of having to wait until every concern raised by 27 other nations is addressed during negotiations, we can cut to the chase. It's striking how successful countries outside the EU have been at negotiating trade deals. Switzerland has opened markets of $40 trillion, while Canada has negotiated 10 trade deals since 2009 alone. Critically, new deals could include enhanced arrangements for developing nations. At the moment, the EU maintains a common external tariff on goods of up to 183%. That means produce from Africa or Asia's poorer nations costs far more to import than it should. By maintaining such a punitive level of tariffs on imports, the EU holds developing nations back. An independent Britain could choose to strike free trade agreements with emerging economies and lower our tariffs, extending new opportunities to developing nations, and in the process, allowing prices in Britain to become cheaper. Leaving the EU would thus help the poorest nations in the world to advance, and it would help the poorest people in this country to make ends meet. It's just one of a number of ways in which leaving the European Union allows us to advance more progressive policies. Now, taking back control of our trade policy would strengthen our country's economic power. But that's not the only direct economic benefit of voting to leave. If we left the EU, we would take back control of over £19 billion, which we currently hand over every year. That's about £350 million each and every week. Now, it is true that we get some of that money back, £4.4 billion through a negotiated rebate, and £4.8 billion in money that the EU spends in this country on our behalf. But it is also vital to note that the amount that we give to the EU is due to go up and up and up, from £19.1 billion this year to £20.6 billion in 2021. Since 1975, we've already sent the staggering sum of over £500 billion to Brussels. If we vote to stay, we'll send about another £200 billion to Brussels over the next decade. And it's also important to recognise that our rebate is not a permanent and unalterable feature of our membership anchored in the treaties. It's a negotiated settlement, which has had to be renegotiated before. And it could be eroded, whittled away, or rendered less and less significant in future negotiations. One of the reasons that we have the rebate is the fear that Britain might leave. Once we vote to stay, then it will be open season on that sum. I also acknowledge that some of the money that we send over we get back, whether in support for farmers or scientists, although we don't control exactly where it goes. And we don't know how efficiently that money is allocated to those who really need it because of the opaque nature of the EU's bureaucracy. Indeed, there's a lot of evidence that money sticks to bureaucratic fingers rather than going to the front line. The physicist, André Geim, the genius who won the Nobel Prize for his work on graphene, said of the EU's science funding system, "I can offer no nice words for the EU framework programmes, which can be praised only by Europhobes for discrediting the whole idea of an effectively working Europe." In any case, no one arguing that we should vote leave wants us to reduce the amount that we give to our farmers or our scientists. Indeed, some of us believe that we should give more. The only British citizens that we want to deprive of European funding are our MEPs. We'd like to liberate them to flourish in the private sector. Yet, thank you, Dan. Even if we acknowledge the rebate and the sums already spent, it's the case that £10.6 billion of taxpayers' money is given to the EU in a year. That's twice the UK's science budget, twice Scotland's schools budget. Just think what we could do with the money. It could be invested in new infrastructure, apprenticeships and science. It could be deployed in our NHS, schools and social care. It could pay for tax cuts, enterprise allowances and trade missions. It could even pay for 14 Astute-class submarines. It could enhance this nation's security, productivity, social solidarity and competitiveness. And the economic benefits of leaving wouldn't end there. We would also be able to reduce the regulatory costs imposed on British business. The cost of EU regulation on British companies has been estimated by the independent think tank Open Europe at about £600 million every week. Now, some of those costs are incurred in a good cause, but many EU regulations, such as the Clinical Trials Directive, which has slowed down and made more expensive the testing of new cancer drugs, or absurd rules such as minimum container sizes for the sale of olive oil, are clearly not wise, light touch and proportionate interventions in the market. They also show how the so-called single market is, as Jacques Delors promised, a vehicle for expanding the power of the EU, not a tool for expanding free trade. If we leave the EU, we can progressively reduce the burden of EU regulation and help generate new jobs and industries. We can also insulate ourselves from new EU rules that other nations are planning, which are designed to hold back innovation. It's striking that EU institutions have already repeatedly tried, and will of course continue to attempt, to fetter the tech companies that are changing the world's economy. As Harvard's Professor John Gillingham has pointed out, the development of fifth-generation telecoms technology and the arrival of the Internet of Things promise massive productivity gains. But the EU has tried to stand in the way of the companies driving this change. Professor Gillingham argues that the EU stance is, quote, guerrilla warfare, which is, quote, futile as well as self-defeating. It can only accelerate the rate of European decline. And the figures back him up. The EU and its members are projected to grow more slowly than other advanced economies in the years ahead. Eurozone members are projected to grow at 1.5%, while the US is projected to grow at 2.4%, China at 6.5%, New Zealand at 2.0%, Australia at 2.5%, and India at 7.5%. But it's not just freedom from EU regulation that leaving would liberate us to enjoy. We could also benefit economically from control of migration. At the moment, any EU citizen can come to the UK to settle work, claim benefits and use the NHS. We have no proper control over whether that individual's presence here is economically beneficial, conducive to the public good, or in our national interest. We cannot effectively screen new arrivals for qualifications, extremist connections, or past criminality. We've given away control over how we implement the vital 1951 UN Convention on Asylum to the European Court. We cannot even deport convicted murderers. Further, there are 5 more countries, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and Turkey, in the queue to join the EU. And the European Commission, as we've just experienced ourselves during the recent negotiation process, regards free movement as an inviolable principle, one of the essential freedoms in EU membership. Yesterday's report from the Treasury is an official admission from the In campaign that if we do vote to stay in the EU, then immigration can continue to increase by hundreds of thousands year on year. Over 250,000 people came to Britain from Europe last year. As long as we're in the EU, we cannot control our borders. And we cannot develop an immigration policy which is both truly humane and in our long-term economic interests. It's bad enough that we have to maintain an open door to EU nationals from the shores of Sicily to the borders of the Ukraine. It's also the case that as the price of EU membership, we have to impose stricter limitations on individuals from other nations whom we might actively want to welcome. Whether it's family members from Commonwealth countries, the top doctors and scientists who could enhance the operation of the NHS, or the technicians and innovators who could power growth, we have to put them at the back of the queue behind anyone who's granted citizenship by any other EU country. I think we'd benefit as a country if we had a more effective and humane immigration policy, allowing us to take the people who would benefit us economically, offering refuge to those genuinely in need, and saying no to others. And my ambition is not a utopian ideal, it's an Australian reality. Instead of a European open-door migration policy, we could, if a future government wanted it, have an Australian points-based migration policy. We could emulate that country's admirable record of taking in genuine refugees, giving a welcome to hard-working new citizens, and building a successful multi-racial society without giving in to people smugglers, illegal migration, or subversion of our borders. So leaving could mean control over new trade deals, control over how we can help developing nations, control over economic rules, control over how billions currently spent by others could be spent, control over our borders, control over who uses the NHS, and control over who can make their home here. Leaving would also bring another significant and underappreciated benefit. It would lead to the reform of the European Union. At different points in campaigners like to argue either that Brexit would lead to EU nations using their massive muscle to punish us, or that Brexit would lead to contagion and the collapse of Europe, just as Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union collapsed following secession from those unions. Manifestly, both cannot be true. An EU without the UK cannot simultaneously be a supercharged Leviathan bent on revenge and a crumbling Tower of Babel riven by conflict. But both points do have a grain of truth. There will be anger amongst some in European elites, not because the UK is destined for a bleak, impoverished future on the outside. No, quite the opposite. What will enrage and disorientate EU elites is the UK's success outside the Union. Regaining control over our laws, taxes and borders, forging new trade deals while also shedding unnecessary regulations will enhance our competitive advantage over other EU nations. Our superior growth rate and better growth prospects will only strengthen. Our attractiveness to inward investors and our influence on the world stage will only grow. But while this might provoke both angst and even resentment amongst EU elites, the UK's success will send a very different message to the EU's peoples. They will see that a different Europe is possible. It's possible to regain democratic control of your own country and currency. It's possible to trade and cooperate with other EU nations without surrendering fundamental sovereignty to a remote and unelected bureaucracy. And by following that path, your people are richer, your influence for good is greater, your future is brighter. So yes, there will be contagion if Britain leaves the EU, but what will be catching is democracy. There will be a new demand for more effective institutions to enable the more flexible kind of international cooperation that we will need as technological and economic forces transform the world. We know from repeated referenda on the continent and in Ireland that the peoples of the EU are profoundly unhappy with the European project. We also know that the framers of that project, Monnet and Schuman, hoped to advance integration by getting around democracy and never submitting their full vision to the verdict of voters. That approach has characterised the behaviour of EU leaders ever since. But that approach could not and will not survive the assertion of deep democratic principle that would be the British people voting to leave. Our vote to leave will liberate and strengthen those voices across the EU calling for a different future, those demanding the devolution of power back from Brussels, those desperate for a progressive alternative. For Greeks who've had to endure dreadful austerity measures in order to secure bailouts from Brussels, which then go to pay off bankers demanding their due, a different Europe will be a liberation. For Spanish families whose children have had to endure years of joblessness, and for whom a home and children of their own is a desperately distant prospect, a different Europe will be a liberation. For Portuguese citizens who've had to endure cuts to health, welfare and public services as the price of EU policies, a different Europe will be a liberation. For Italians whose elected government was dismissed by Brussels fiat. For Danes whose opt-out from the Maastricht Treaty has been repeatedly overridden by the European Court. For Poles whose hard-won independence has been eroded by the European Commission. A different Europe will be a liberation. For Britain, voting to leave will be a galvanising, liberating, empowering moment of patriotic renewal. We will have rejected the depressing and pessimistic vision advanced by campaigners that Britain is too small and weak and the British people too hapless and pathetic to manage their own affairs and choose their own future. But for Europe, Britain voting to leave will be the beginning of something potentially even more exciting, the democratic liberation of a whole continent. If we vote to leave, we will have, in the words of a former British Prime Minister, saved our country by our exertions and Europe by our example. We will have confirmed that we believe that our best days lie ahead, that we believe that our children can build a better future, that this country's instincts and its institutions, its people and its principles, are capable not just of making our society freer, fairer and richer, but also once more of setting an inspirational example to the world. It's a noble ambition, and one I hope that this country will unite behind in the weeks to come. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We're going to take a couple of questions now. I will take one first from the press. Laura from the BBC.
Thank you. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News. Secretary of State, you could banish the bogeymen by being as clear as you can be about what the economy would look like if we leave. In the simplest of terms, can you describe what our trading relationships would look like with the rest of the EU and the rest of the world? And is the Vote Leave campaign now explicitly ruling out trying to stay in the single market?
We would be part of a free trade zone that extends from Iceland to the Russian border, that includes all the nations of the European landmass apart from Russia and Belarus. By being part of that free trade zone, we would have full access to the European market, but we would be freed from EU regulation that costs us billions of pounds every year. And free access to that market would also mean that we would not have to accept the European Court of Justice imposing unwanted rules on our manufacturers. We would also be free to take our own seat on the World Trade Organization, free, therefore, to press for more free trade deals across the world, including with countries like America and China and India, that the European Union, because of its bureaucratic clunkiness, has been unable to form a deal with.
We'll take one from Faisal from Sky.
A follow-up on that. You refer to the so-called single market. Is it the Leave campaign's policy to leave the single market, not to be part of the EEA, therefore not have financial services passporting, which the Bank of England has said is seriously problematic for our banking sector?
It's our policy to be part of a free trade area. Financial services are already flourishing in London. We were told before, when the single currency was being established, that London would shrivel and die as a financial centre if we were outside the single currency. If we're outside the European Union but part of a free trade zone, then the ingenuity, the energy and the attractiveness of London as a financial capital will ensure that our financial services continue to thrive.
Chris Shipp from ITV.
Thank you very much, Chris Shipp, ITV News. You've just said, and I use your words, we would have full access to the single market but be free from the regulations. Can you name me a single other country that has its cake and eats it? And I suspect in the answer to this question, you will not be able to name that country.
Well, Britain is in a unique position. I should say that other countries which are outside the European Union but benefit from this free trade have faster growth rates than many Eurozone countries, but those countries tend to have significantly smaller populations than our own. More than that, as I pointed out in my speech, European Union nations sell more to us than we sell to them. Why would they wish to cut off their nose to spite their face? And even if there were an EU politician bent on that act of economic self-harm, do we really believe that in Germany, that car workers would accept losing jobs as the price of the vanity of a particular leader? Do we really believe that a French president or prime minister would deliberately seek to restrict French farmers' access to our markets? I don't believe that's credible.
We'll take a couple of questions from the audience as well, who under these lights is incredible. Any hands? The gentleman in the light blue top over there on the far left. If you could just wait for the microphone to come to you.
Good morning. How do you see the role of the British fishing industry if we vote to leave?
Well, you touch on an issue very, very close to my heart. Some in this audience, I suspect very few, might know that my father inherited a fish merchant's business in Aberdeen from my grandfather. And that business went to the wall partly as a result of the Common Fisheries Policy. The Common Fisheries Policy essentially gave other European Union nations unfettered access to our fish stocks. And I would hope that if we leave the European Union, we can once more see the ports of Peterborough and Fraser Head and Grimsby flourishing because we take back control of our territorial waters. Now, I recognise that fishing is perhaps not the most high employment industry in this country, but it's a symbol of what we lost when we entered the European Union. Control over natural resources that if we'd retained them, we could have husbanded in our interests and indeed in the interests of others.
We'll take the gentleman at the back. If you just wait for a second while the microphone comes to you.
Isn't the choice in this campaign for Vote Leave either to lose with a technocratic argument or to win with an ethnic appeal to the English nation?
No, I don't believe that at all. I think that we are going to win because we have a full spectrum argument. And by full spectrum, I mean we're optimistic about every area of our national life. I actually think, and I'm going to give a speech on this subject in due course, that the United Kingdom would be strengthened, not weakened, by our exit from the European Union. I also believe that we would be a force for progressive good on the world stage. I also believe that people who want to see more investment in public services and people who also want to see our economy liberated to generate more jobs, all of them will find the arguments that we will put forward during the course of this campaign compelling. It's an optimistic, positive appeal to people's best instincts.
And we'll take a question or two from the print media. Go on, Harry, you've had your hand up highest.
Secretary of State, Harry Cole from The Sun. We've seen the 9.3 million spent on the leaflets. We've seen the 24-strong Cabinet Office referendum unit. Yesterday's dodgy dossier from the Treasury. Do you feel that the government is stacking the referendum against the Out campaign? And do you think that might have an impact on the legitimacy of the result? And just one quick question, if I may, on Ian Atkinson's review into extremism in prisons. It's leaked this morning, and some speculation that it's been delayed by number 10 until after the referendum. Is that a view you share, and should it be published immediately?
On the first point about the odds and all the rest of it, I made it clear that I didn't think that it was necessarily the best use of taxpayers' money to create the leaflet that the government published. But I'm not going to complain about the rules. It's a fair fight. The Prime Minister has been generous enough to allow members of the Cabinet like me to make the case that I've made. And I think that I should acknowledge his graciousness and generosity and instinctive sense of fair play in allowing me and others, genuinely, allowing me and others to make the case. So I'm not going to, no, apart from the leaflet, I'm absolutely not going to criticise. On the question of the Ian Atkinson report, again, I've had nothing but support from other government colleagues in taking appropriate steps to investigate the dangers of extremism within our jails, and we'll publish that report in due course.
And we'll take Francis Elliott from The Times at the front.
David Cameron said he would trigger Article 50 immediately after the referendum result. You say it would. You could set the pace. Is he lying, or would you force him or change Prime Minister?
I don't think there's any need to trigger Article 50 immediately. And indeed, when Greenland left the European Union, it didn't use Article 50 at all. So all I would say is that there are a range of options, and it will be within our control.
And one last question, and we will take Laura Hughes from The Telegraph.
Hi. Yesterday, George Osborne described you and some of your cabinet colleagues as being economically illiterate. Are you offended by that?
No, George has called me much worse in private and in public.
I think that is it for now. I think Michael has done a brilliant job under, what can I tell you, is some of the hottest lights out there. So, I think
So
you could,
a
thank him in the
speech
customary
peppered
way.
with
I appreciate
bursts of laughter.
Thank you.
The Justice Secretary Michael Gove setting out the case for the UK leaving the European Union.